Hi, Founder fans. Jason here with Michael Troy of the American Revolution podcast, back for another on our series of discussions of generals of the American Revolution. And today, just one guy, the one and only Benedict Arnold. Michael, thank you for coming back.
Pleasure to be here, Jason.
All right, so let's talk about Benedict Arnold. It's going to be a fun time. Benedict Arnold originally hails from Connecticut. So
Yeah, that's right. He's born and bred. He's actually a descendant of a colonial governor, comes from a really good family, whole bit.
right, but I understand his father was kind of the black sheep of that family, lost a good deal of the family's fortunes, and Arnold, if I'm not mistaken, is apprenticed to an uncle who's a merchant.
That's right. His father does not do very well in life and dies when Arnold is very young. And so Arnold has to make his own way in life. And he um, begins an apprenticeship with his uncle, who is a pharmacist.
Right. And most people might be surprised to know that Benedict Arnold seems to be quite a brilliant young man, because he does. He is apprenticed to his uncle, and they go and although, like you said, he's an apothecary, I believe it is.
Yeah.
Um, he ends up learning through that about trading and purchasing and buying and selling, and ends up becoming a merchant.
Yeah, his father, I think, was from a merchant family, so I think he probably had other relatives who were in that business, but he does get very involved in the merchant trade and um, develops his own fleet of ships and is actually quite wealthy and successful. Um, he also fights in the French, well, fighting in the French and Indian War is a bit of an overstatement. He goes off with a force of militia to fight in the French and Indian War. Um, they are going to relieve a British force at Fort William, and that fort is overrun, and the entire garrison is massacred before they get there. So they kind of turn around and go home. They don't actually do any fighting. But that is kind of pointed to one of the reasons why Arnold really hated the French. They were responsible for the massacre there. It was considered a dishonorable killing of prisoners after the fort had been taken. Um, is actually done by the Indians who were under the command of the French. So Arnold really had I mean, most New Englanders were not too happy toward French people anyway, but that I think really kind of pushed him to another level.
Right. Uh, and as we will see, he also seems to have thirsted for glory on the battlefield. Now, as you say, he wasn't really a self made man. His family did have wealth, but most of it, his father set him back a lot. But as you said, he owns a fleet of ships, is very successful, close enough to a self made man. And then Britain starts changing tax policies, which, as a merchant, must have affected him.
Right. He's a successful New England merchant. He's married to a woman named Peggy, who was also from a very good family. They have a couple of kids. He's living the good life. When all the uh, problems with the British start, and I mean, part of it is the non-importation agreements that are being put in place, really kind of stalls his business. He's able to ride it out. He has enough wealth, and he does some smuggling and stuff like that. Which, I mean, we today we call smuggling a bad word. It was almost the norm among New England merchants at the time. It basically just meant you didn't want to pay a huge tax on whatever stuff you were shipping into the country. And, the best Americans were smugglers. I mean, John Hancock, all sorts of people can be given that label, but I think it has a different connotation today when it's dealing with illegal drugs and things like that. And this was pretty much a legitimate import business. He just didn't want to pay all his taxes to the crown.
Right. It would
So
have
yeah,
helped. I'm sorry, I was going to say it would have also helped average people purchase these things, which were average household items for the most part.
Right, and you almost had to smuggle because it was a highly competitive business, and if your imports cost twice as much as everybody else because of tariffs, no one was going to buy your stuff.
Right.
So yeah, it was kind of expected to be a smuggler.
Right.
But
So,
yeah,
as with most smugglers and merchants in general, Benedict Arnold uh, sides with the Patriot cause.
he sides with the Patriots. He follows the non-importation agreements, the whole bit. He is a captain in the Connecticut militia. New England officers were elected by their men, so this kind of shows that he had a certain amount of popularity in the area. Um, I mean, part of it was personality, part of it was your social and economic position within the town as well. And he must have had a little of both because he did command a company of men. So yeah, he was um, in a reasonably good position. I mean, he obviously wasn't, a general or a governor or elected official or anything like that, but he was, a relatively popular local young officer and merchant.
Right. And then, unless I'm skipping anything, Lexington and Concord happens.
Lexington and Concord happens, and Arnold wants to bring his company up to the Boston area as quickly as possible. And this is where he runs into his first real confrontation. The guy who is in charge of the arsenal says, sorry, you can't have any guns or ammunition. We're not going to let you check out anything. And Arnold's like, you do know that a war just started, right? And we have to go fight it, right? And this guy's worried about, paperwork and the legalities of taking out firearms without authorization and all this stuff. And Arnold basically has to threaten to beat the guy and break into it before he finally backs down and gives him the arms that Arnold was looking for. And Arnold heads off to Boston. Now, interestingly, on the way to Boston, he comes across another Connecticut politician, and Arnold gets to talking to him about Fort Ticonderoga. Arnold had been as a merchant, had regularly traveled to Quebec and was very familiar with the route and very familiar with the state of defenses at Ticonderoga, which were pretty negligible. And he tells this guy, we should really just go take that fort before the British reinforce it. Um, the politician agrees with Arnold. They kind of go on their way without doing anything. And then that politician eventually reaches out to Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys and says, yeah, you guys should go take Fort Ticonderoga. By this time, Arnold is up at Boston and he's making the same pitch to George Washington and other officers saying, I'm sorry, George Washington's not there yet, but some of the other Massachusetts officers saying, we should really go take Fort Ticonderoga.
Joseph
So
Warren, probably.
Warren, yeah, was among them, but yeah, he's talking to the whole committee of safety,
Right.
um, and they give Arnold a commission as a Massachusetts colonel. So he is a Connecticut officer with a Massachusetts commission now.
Yeah.
And they say, yeah, go raise a force of men in Western Massachusetts. There's plenty of them out there waiting to go do something. So just go out there and recruit them and then march up to Ticonderoga and take it. So Arnold heads off to start doing that when he hears that Ethan Arnold and the Green Mountain Boys are already only a few miles away from Fort Ticonderoga and getting ready to take it. So Arnold forgets about all the recruiting and just dashes off to go meet with the Green Mountain Boys and all that. And he basically barges into one of their meetings and says, hey guys, I'm a Massachusetts colonel. I'm in command of this operation now. Let's go take Fort Ticonderoga. And Ethan Allen's like, yeah, no, you're not in command of anything here, buddy. I don't care what piece of paper you have. I'm in command. I'm going to go take Fort Ticonderoga. So they fight about it for a while. Arnold later says that they agreed to share command. Ethan Allen was kind of like, yeah, I'm in command. If you want to come along with me, that's fine. Um, so yeah, Arnold and Ethan Allen take Fort Ticonderoga together.
Right. My
Uh,
favorite part of that story is how, at the time, Vermont was kind of its own thing, but was more associated, I'd say, with New Hampshire. But New York thought it was part of New York, but no one thought it was part of Massachusetts, under
No.
whose authority he was acting. And definitely a guy from Connecticut, under the authority of Massachusetts, had no say over people from Vermont.
Yeah, Connecticut actually had a claim on Vermont too, because Connecticut claimed everything.
That's true.
But um, yeah, so that was probably even worse because the last thing you wanted if you were a New Hampshire man was letting a Connecticut man go in to take this controversial area, which Britain had claimed was part of New York already. So yeah, this was a whole disputed area. It was a whole mess. But as I said, they saw Arnold as kind of this adventurer, but he had no army. He was just one guy in a uniform, so they didn't really have much respect for him. But they let him come along and be a part of the taking of the fort, but they did not really give him any credit, which is going to become a common theme in Arnold's life. And Arnold kind of gets shunted aside. Now Arnold actually does do some really valuable things there because the Green Mountain Boys were they were a bunch of drunken frat boys. They weren't real organized, disciplined soldiers. So they take Fort Ticonderoga, and the first thing they do is find the fort's stash of rum and just get roaring drunk for several days. Um,
Yeah.
Arnold, of course, is concerned that there's another fort up the street, Fort Crown Point, and there's a whole nother British garrison just up the river or up the lake. Over the border in Canada, we might want to start preparing for a counterattack, guys. Um, so the Green Mountain Boys are like, yeah, no, we're getting drunk now. It's party time. We took the fort. That's what we came here to do, and we're done. Fortunately for Arnold, remember he had been on a recruiting mission in Western Massachusetts, and he had left several subordinate officers to continue that recruiting. So over the next few days, some of these soldiers and officers start showing up. So he actually does get his own unit a few days after the capture of the fort. And I am being kind of unfair to the Green Mountain Boys. A few of them were doing some good stuff. Seth Warner actually went and captured Crown Point.
Yeah, you read my mind. Yeah.
So there was some stuff going on. Arnold likes to make himself the hero of his own story, but there was some other stuff going on. But Arnold does capture a couple of ships on Lake Champlain, starts building his own fleet, and he goes up to the Canadian border and raids a British shipyard there that has the potential of being a base for offensive actions against them.
Pretty
Ethan
much all
Allen,
by himself.
he takes a few men.
I mean,
yeah.
he brings his men with him, but he's just like, I'm going to go raid Canada for a little bit.
Yeah, he did it on his own. Yeah. No authority from anyone to do this. Ethan Allen hears about him going to raid Canada and realizes that he should really go up there too because he doesn't want Arnold getting credit for anything. So Arnold goes up and raids the area, but he finds out that the British are sending reinforcements, and so they pull out very quickly and start heading back to Fort Ticonderoga. He meets Ethan Allen on the lake while Arnold's coming back, and Ethan Allen's still going forward. And Arnold says, yeah, they're getting a whole bunch of reinforcements. We really need to pull back. Ethan Allen's like, yeah, pussies from Connecticut may back off, but yeah, we're going to go up there anyway. We don't care. Ethan Allen, of course, arrives and is very quickly overwhelmed. He's almost captured, but he does escape and goes running back to Ticonderoga. So Arnold was right, Allen was wrong.
Whoopsie daisy.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I guess we should acknowledge that the Green Mountain Boys were backcountry woodsmen who, as you said, like to get hammered drunk, but could be very tough.
They were very hard fighters. They had been fighting against New Yorkers for a couple of decades by this point, and they got into some really brutal scrapes with them. So yeah, they were they were not unaccustomed to fighting.
Right.
But they weren't an army. They were really more of a mob.
Right, exactly. And we did bring it up when we talked about Philip Schuyler, that they had been fighting with New York for a very long time. So taking Fort Ticonderoga looked like, wait a minute, did they just invade New York? What's going on here?
New Yorkers were very upset by Fort Ticonderoga being captured, and Arnold does send a messenger to Philadelphia to let the Continental Congress know that they've taken Fort Ticonderoga, and the Continental Congress immediately sends a message back saying, "Don't do anything else, and inventory all the property so that when we hand it back over to the British, nothing's been stolen or taken." Uh, they eventually realize that no, we're actually at war with Britain and we're not trying to make nice with them anymore, and they don't follow through on that. But they do very quickly turn over Fort Ticonderoga to New York officers because the New York delegation is like, yeah, you're not letting New Englanders into New York or we're all walking home. You know, that we're done with this whole Continental Congress thing.
Right.
So yeah, it does get turned over to New Yorkers pretty quickly.
Yeah, and all of this is happening in May of 1775. So a month after Lexington and Concord, and a month and a half before George Washington shows up in Massachusetts.
That's right. There's no
Give or take.
Continental Congress yet, or there's no, I mean, no Continental Army yet. The Continental Congress has really just met, like, I think they met like the same day that Arnold and Allen took Fort Ticonderoga was their first actual congressional session day. So they really had no idea what was going on, and they were playing catch up for, you know, and a lot of people were just trying to say, hey, let's not like start a whole war here before
Right.
things get out of control. We had a tiff in at Lexington and Concord, but you know we still want to try to work things out, and that was kind of the mindset of Congress at the time.
Right, and people who may not have heard of either of our shows yet are going to hear us talk a lot about the good things Benedict Arnold did for the first half of this discussion, because yeah, like the Lexington and Concord happened, a bunch of militiamen cornered the British in Boston, and then basically Benedict Arnold goes on the attack. He's like, okay, we're at war, let's go win it, and everyone else is like, maybe we're at war, maybe not.
Right. Benedict Arnold is one of the most aggressive early commanders and really is out to make a name for himself and become a military hero during this thing. And, you know, he doesn't know either. You know, this war could be over in 60, 90 days. So he's out for as much glory as quickly as possible to make a name for himself.
Right. So he retreats back to Ticonderoga after the little skirmish in Canada, and then fairly quickly makes his way back to Boston.
He does. As I said, the New Yorkers took over at Fort Ticonderoga. So you have General Philip Schuyler, who has been appointed by the Continental Congress to be in charge of the region, and Brigadier General Richard Montgomery, who is second in command in the area. They take control of Fort Ticonderoga and the surrounding region, and they say to Arnold, yeah, you know, thanks for the fort, thanks for the fleet, now go away. And Arnold has to go back to Boston and meets with General Washington. Washington's impressed with what he's done. He's shown some initiative. He's shown some success. He, you know, seems to have the makings of a good officer. So he makes a very good impression on George Washington, and Arnold, of course, tries to I'm not saying benefit from it, but play off his good reputation and continue his efforts. And
He wants to be in the Continental Army instead of just the Connecticut and or Massachusetts militia.
right, and he gets a commission in the Continental Army as a colonel, which is reasonable since the man was a captain like 2 months ago. So you know he's doing pretty well for himself. Um,
And I understand he's one of the first people to start telling Washington we should invade Canada.
at at this time, Richard Montgomery is starting to invade Canada. He's already moving into that area. What Arnold suggests to Washington is that we should really open a second front in Canada. Um, Montgomery is going from Port Ticonderoga up Lake Champlain, through a whole bunch of smaller areas past Montreal and up the St. Lawrence River to Quebec. And that's the way people would be expected to go. I mean, that's
There's a road.
right. There's a road, there's a waterway most of the way, so you can take ships. It's the normal route that people would take to get from New York to Quebec, unless you had a really big ship and were, you know, sailing in from Halifax or something. Um, so this was the expected way to go in. Arnold says, well, hey, you know, we could just march across the Maine wilderness, which Maine is part of Massachusetts at this time, but there's really nobody living there except for a few people along the coast. The only people living inland are Native Americans. But we can march across this wilderness and come at Quebec from the northeast, while Montgomery's men are marching up from the southwest. And, we'll come out of nowhere and we'll shock the British, and it'll be an easy way to capture Quebec. And so Washington says, yeah, sure, we're not really doing anything here in Boston right now except sitting here looking at the enemy. Why don't you go give it a try? And he gives him some men, and including some riflemen from Thompson's Rifles, Pennsylvania Riflemen,
Yeah, which
as well as
I
New
believe that
England.
includes Daniel Morgan, or
No,
is he
he
with
doesn't.
Montgomery?
Daniel Morgan is with
All
Montgomery.
right, my mistake.
Uh,
I know he ends up in Quebec
yeah, Morgan is a big part of the whole thing, but the
because I will
the
say I know Aaron Burr, a very young Aaron Burr, I believe goes with Arnold,
he does.
as does Henry Dearborn, who ends
Uh,
up being a Secretary of War because it's I don't spoiler alert for the next 30 seconds of this story, but it's Henry Dearborn's dogs that become food during this adventure.
yeah, among other things, but yeah, yeah, they're marching across the Maine
Right.
wilderness, and they expect it's going to take a couple of weeks. And there's apparently a thing I didn't know about until I started reading about this, but um, British military makes maps of any relevant areas that they think, could be of use at some point, and they had maps of the Maine wilderness and how to get from the coast to Quebec. Apparently, they often have two sets of maps, one that's accurate and one that they distribute to the public to kind of provide some misinformation. And that seems to be what happened in this case, that they knew that it was like several hundred more miles to get across the Maine wilderness than the maps showed. And Arnold was using these maps in his preparations for the Wilderness March, and it ends up being a lot longer than he thought it was going to be. In addition to that, he needed to have some small bateaus, which are basically little rowboats, flat bottom rowboats that they could carry a lot of their equipment and do a lot of the movement upriver on these boats. Unfortunately, the contractor that they hired to put these together makes them out of green wood, makes the boats complete crap, and most of them start falling apart and leaking, and they're almost useless, and they lose a lot of their supplies as a result. So these guys are marching across the Maine wilderness. I think they started in late November, which is not a good time to march across the Maine wilderness. It gets mighty cold up there. Um, they end up drinking some water from a source that they shouldn't have, and the entire army gets dysentery. Which, if you've ever tried to march with the squirts, it's not a pleasant experience. So these guys are miserable.
Right.
They're freezing to death. They're out of food. And Arnold just keeps pushing them on, pushing them on. And there's a whole like part of the army, like a third of the unit, that's not with Arnold. They're marching like separately. They turn around and just go home. They say, "There's no way we're going to make this. We're out of food. We're freezing to death. This is crazy." And they just leave, and they take most of the supplies with them. So Arnold is furious, but he continues on with the remnant that he has. Um, as you say, they're starving to death at this point. They're eating the soles of their shoes, which they boil as to make soup out of the leather. They eat their dogs
Henry
that are
Dearborn's dogs, future Secretary
um,
of War Henry Dearborn.
yeah. It's a really miserable experience. But they do make it. They make it to the outskirts of Quebec, and they finally reach some Canadian um, farms that are kind of on the edge of the Canadian territory. And the Canadians just basically see these guys stumbling out of the wilderness in barefoot and rags, starving to death. They descend on their cattle and take them all and eat them. And Arnold's trying to pay for everything and be, we're not invaders. We're really good guys. We're here to liberate you, that kind of thing.
Or
But
literally starving to death.
yeah, they're a bunch of scarecrows who are starving to death and have nothing.
It is one
Um,
of the most impressive feats of the Revolution. You don't hear people talk about Arnold's trek across Maine very often, but it really is one of.
it makes his reputation early on, much more so than taking Ticonderoga, which Ethan Allen got the credit for. This was what made Arnold, and he famously makes this march, and he actually gets up to the walls of Quebec. And at this time, there's almost no one in Quebec because Richard Montgomery has captured most of the regulars that were in Quebec at the time. They were down at Montreal. So, you have General Guy Carleton is there with like maybe a few dozen regulars at most, and a couple of units of French militia who he really doesn't think are going to fight. And they see Arnold's men coming out at them, and they have a council of war, and they're very seriously debating just turning over the keys to the city to Arnold and giving up. And kind of in the nick of time, um, a bunch of Scottish Highlanders who had moved to the Quebec region show up, and they are good fighting men, and they kind of put some backbone into Carleton and convince him to fight it out. And Arnold was kind of bluffing. He doesn't have enough men to really take the city if they're going to put up any sort of defense. So he has to kind of sit and wait for Richard Montgomery's men to join them before they can try anything else.
Which they do, and they try something else.
They do. I mean, Montgomery gets up there by early December, and they threaten and try to cajole. One of my favorite American Revolution characters that no one's ever heard of is a woman named Jemima Warner. She is a like 16 or 17-year-old girl who was married to a private, one of the Pennsylvania riflemen who made the Wilderness March with Benedict Arnold. So you have this 16-year-old girl who makes the march successfully when so many other grown men are turning back and saying there's no way we can possibly make it. Her husband dies along the way during the Wilderness March, and she buries him and continues on with the army. And she actually um, is the one who brings Arnold's demand of surrender to the city gates and tries to get the British to surrender. They take her prisoner. She's just, she's a traitor who just, they're not respecting a flag of truce or anything. She's a criminal, then they're just throw her in prison. And they decide after a few days to let her go, and she goes back and is helping out at the front lines, bringing water and ammunition to the men and stuff like that. And she's shot in the head and killed instantly. And so it's really kind of a tragic ending to somebody who really showed some real heroism for, you know,
Yeah, that's a
from an
fascinating
unconventional.
character, and she's killed during the battle, the attempted invasion of the city, which occurs on New Year's Eve.
Well, she's actually killed before Richard Montgomery gets there. They're besieging the city, and the two sides are kind of just taking pot shots at each other.
Oh, is that early? Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Oh, that's tough. It's even
yeah,
worse. It's not even during
right.
the battle.
Yeah. So yeah, she's just kind of killed because she popped her head up at the wrong time, and a British rifleman got a good shot at her.
Oof. Okay, great.
But anyway, so Richard Montgomery does get there,
Yep.
and they try to again bluster into getting the garrison to give up the city. They're unwilling to do so. Um, Montgomery and Arnold both have much depleted forces at this point. And their big problem is that most of the militia that are with them have their enlistments expire on December 31st, 1775. So if they don't take the city, and this is already like mid-December, if they don't take the city very soon, their army is just going to dissolve and go away. So they make several attempts in the last week of December to but the weather does not cooperate with them. So they finally, really, literally end up launching the attack on the night of December 31st, the very last possible day that they still had an army. And
It
General
does not
Montgomery,
go well.
right, General Montgomery attacks from the south. General Arnold's men attack from the north. Daniel Morgan at this point is with General Arnold. I believe Aaron Burr is with the forces with Richard Montgomery. Um,
Well, I know Burr did the march with Arnold, and it's funny. That's probably why I thought for uh, uh, Morgan was with Arnold because he ends up with Arnold for the actual attack.
right, they kind of move people around once they're all together, but uh, the riflemen are kind of considered the elite troops of the army at this time, and through most of the war, actually. Muskets were horribly inaccurate weapons. Um, if you weren't within 40 feet of a person, you had virtually no chance of actually hitting them. Even if they're lined up shoulder to shoulder, 40 men wide, you're still probably not going to hit anyone. The rifles were good, from 100, even 200-300 yards. Some people could sometimes pick someone off. So they were very effective. And so the riflemen were kind of the rock stars. Rifles were not traditionally used in battle because you could only fire a rifle maybe 6 or 7 times before they got so dirty that you couldn't shove another bullet down the barrel because the bullet had to fit really tightly against the barrel. And once they got filled with residue from the black powder, you couldn't fire them. So rifles were commonly used for hunting. They weren't used in warfare for just that reason, because you couldn't have an extended battle with them. But in the types of fighting that we're doing here, where you know fights are over after 5 or 6 shots, they really proved to be a real benefit, and they really kind of served in the place of artillery because the Americans didn't have a lot of artillery, and they certainly didn't have a lot of powder to put into artillery. So they
And,
tended to use rifles instead of cannons.
and what they
Um,
got at Ticonderoga was currently being dragged south to Boston by Henry Knox at this time.
right. So yeah, they didn't have access to any of that. So um, right. So people like Morgan were very considered, elite forces and all this. So anyway, Arnold has um, the riflemen with him as well as some regular soldiers, and they're attacking from the north, and Montgomery's men are attacking from the south. And uh, it would be nice if we had a map here, but the way Quebec is kind of set up is it has a main gate on the eastern side, and it has rivers kind of flowing around it on the north and south. But there is a little bit strip of land between the wall and the river where people can kind of slip by, and they're trying to get around behind the main fort to where the actual town is, and that the walls aren't as high there and the defenses aren't as good. And so their hope is to kind of go around the main part of the fort, get into the residential areas, and just overwhelm everyone, and then storm the fort from the backside. That's their goal. Um, Montgomery leads the initial charge against the south side, gets blown away by a cannon in some of the first shots of the battle,
Right
and
away.
he's killed instantly.
Yeah.
And
Not great.
most of the men who are with him turn and run, and they're, as an effective fighting force, they're done for the day. Arnold's men are attacking from the north. Arnold is also shot very early on in the fighting. He's shot in the leg, uh, which means he really can't continue on with his men. And Daniel Morgan takes command of the remaining force, and they enter the actual town of Quebec. Unfortunately, it was such a small number of men who actually finally made it into the town that the British are able to quickly overwhelm and surround them, and most of the people who entered the town are taken prisoner. Arnold is able to escape because he didn't actually enter the prison, and so he kind of takes command of what little men are left. At this point, they have no serious hope of retaking the city. Many of the men are enlistments are over, want to go home. And Arnold is just like, you know, guys, we have to stay here. We have to at least put up a face until we can get some reinforcements. And so he's just, and he's trying to deal with a horrific leg wound at the same time. So it's kind of a miserable time for him. But that's where he is at this point.
And then not long after, future important player Johnny Burgoyne shows up from the reinforcements that landed in Halifax, I believe, and then they march
Yeah,
down.
well, yeah, we're in January now. Both sides are kind of waiting for reinforcements, and whichever reinforcements get there first, they're going to get Quebec. So, in other words, if the Continentals had sent up a couple of thousand soldiers and they'd gotten there quickly, they could have taken Quebec. And then when the British arrived, when the British relief fleet arrived, they would be behind the walls with cannons, and they could possibly fend off the whole relief fleet. If the British relief fleet got there first, then it was kind of game over. The Americans did send a few up. They actually sent a new commander up, a Connecticut general by the name of David Wooster, who Arnold did not like, and they did not get along at all. And
Typical.
Wooster kind of was trying to command from Montreal, and eventually, after a month or two, comes up and takes command at Quebec and basically tells Arnold to go away because Arnold's not listening to him.
Wooster at this point just turned down the position of brigadier general in the army.
No, he was a brigadier. He accepted it.
Did he accept it? Because didn't he like walk away because he was unhappy
He did walk
that
away
what's his name got
initially.
it? Putnam.
He was a major general in the Connecticut militia, and he wanted to be a major general in the Continental Army.
Right.
And he had walked away, but they convinced him to come back, and he did take the position as a brigadier.
Oh, okay.
There's some debate about whether he did formally accept it or not, but he is considered a brigadier general. He is on the books as a brigadier.
Okay. Because I was under the impression that he was like, no, I'm just gonna stay in Connecticut, and then they asked him to help. He's like, I'll help.
No, he pulls rank on Arnold and basically says, "I'm the commanding officer
Fair
here
enough.
now."
Yeah.
All that. So yeah, he's considered a brigadier general in the Continental Army. They try a few things to kind of trick the garrison at Quebec into surrendering, but nothing works. And then in the spring, like March or April, Burgoyne's relief fleet shows up, and at that point, all bets are off. They have to retreat.
So
And
they do retreat. They
they retreat.
make their way to, is it Montreal?
Yeah, the Americans start getting some more reinforcements at this point. General John Thomas comes up, and unfortunately, the Continental Army is hit with a terrible plague of smallpox, and very large numbers of the men who are sent there die, including General Thomas. I think David Wooster, about the time Thomas arrived, just left because if he couldn't be in command, he was done. They eventually send up General Sullivan, but General Sullivan gets there. By the time the British arrived at Quebec, they almost immediately go on the offensive and just start pushing the Americans back. And there is some fighting. There's an interesting battle. Anthony Wayne gets some interesting action at this time. He's up there. He's a colonel at this time too. So yeah, there is some interesting fighting going on. Excuse me. And Arnold is in the thick of it, acquitting himself well as a combat officer. But the Americans decide they really do have to retreat, or they're all just going to be captured. So they eventually do pull back into New York. And Benedict Arnold vows to be the last man to leave Canada, and is like on, all of his men have already crossed the water into New York, and he's there. He actually sees the British charging at him, trying to capture him. He defiantly shoots his horse in the head to deny it to the British, jumps in a boat, and is the last man to leave Canada.
Yeah, classic.
Uh,
Classic Arnold. Always needs to get that last word in. You can see why he makes so many enemies throughout his career. So he sails south. Has already begun being a hero at this point to many of the rank and file soldiers, if not many of just your average patriotic Americans. They move south, head back down. He heads back down to Ticonderoga at this point, I believe, and that's when he establishes a relationship with General Schuyler.
Yes, he establishes a relationship with General Schuyler and also the newly arrived Major General Horatio Gates, who also arrives on the scene around the same time. Gates was supposed to take command of the army in Quebec, but by the time he arrives near Quebec, there is no army in Quebec. They're all in New York. And that's kind of the beginning of the whole fight between Gates and Schuyler. Gates says, "Well, this is my army. I'm taking command of it." And Schuyler says, "Well, no, you were in charge of Quebec, and this isn't Quebec. This is New York, and I'm in command in New York."
Right.
And so the two of them have an ongoing fight. They try to cooperate. They try to look good, make themselves look like they're being the bigger man, but they're just fighting with each other and trying to throw the other under the bus at every opportunity. Arnold actually gets along with both of them at this point and tries to play peacemaker a little bit. Um, Arnold does have, as I said, have a good reputation. He's still a colonel, but he is considered one of the best combat officers in the Continental Army at this point, and both Gates and Schuyler respect him.
Though we should note, because it is during that evacuation of Canada when they're traveling south, that for the first time there were a few people complaining about Benedict Arnold.
Arnold does have a habit of making enemies wherever he goes as well. That's true.
Like this is
And
the first time it's like official complaints to
he gets
Congress.
into a big fight with a man named Moses Hazen, who is a Quebec uh, resident of Quebec who joins the Continental Army. And he eventually rises to the rank of brigadier general in the Continental Army and commands a regiment of mostly Quebec volunteers. Um, Arnold, I forget the exact details of it. Arnold like sends some supplies that he had taken from Montreal merchants that he had personally vouched for um, with his own credit. Um, Sends them to Hazen, and Hazen's like, "Yeah, I'm not dealing with that crap," and he just kind of leaves it on sitting on the side of the river. And of course, all the stuff gets stolen. Arnold's furious about this. Tries to bring Moses Hazen up on charges. Um, they eventually do have a court martial which is completely stacked with friends of Moses Hazen and people who hate Arnold. So they basically sit there for a day and acquit him. Arnold's furious about that, starts bad mouthing the court martial. Then the court martial wants to try Arnold for contempt and all sorts of other random charges. And eventually Horatio Gates has to step in and say, "No, we're not trying Arnold right now. We're about to be invaded by the British. We're not dealing with these petty squabbles right now." But yeah, Arnold is not making friends.
No, but that's really his first time having run-ins with certain members of the how do you say, Continental Army slash Congress establishment.
Right. He has other issues as well. He's in control of a ship on the St. Lawrence River, and he gets orders um, from a new commander. I forget whether it was Sullivan or who it was at the particular time that basically relieves him of command and just tells him to leave immediately. And all of the men who were on the ship, Arnold had promised to pay them, and was their commander. And Arnold just kind of was like, "Yeah, sorry, I'm not in command anymore. Can't help you." And so they actually end up taking him prisoner and holding him hostage until they get paid. And so there's this whole fight with that as well. So just one of many messes that Arnold keeps finding himself getting
I
into.
didn't hear that story, but you know what? That's the type of thing. As we said, Arnold is really adored by the men who fight for him, and
Yeah,
it's probably the type of thing where he voluntarily was hostage sized. I don't know the past tense of becoming a
taken out.
hostage,
Yeah,
but it
yeah,
certainly seems like the type of thing Arnold would do to help those men. Like you said, he was promised to pay them. You know,
right. Arnold was highly respected as a field commander. He retained the respect of the men in that they knew that he would take care of them and that he would do his best to win a battle and that sort of thing. So yeah, his men had a lot of respect for him, and so did a lot of other officers who knew of his work. On a personal level, if you hung out with Arnold, he tended to be rather caustic, rather would get into a fight at the drop of a hat,
Right.
and it was very easy to get on his bad side, and he very much got on the other people's bad side. So he did not make a lot of friends in the army on a personal level.
Right. But continuing with his heroics, they're at Ticonderoga. The British are coming down from the north, and they need to put a stop to this. So Benedict Arnold is, I understand Horatio Gates technically oversees this operation, but Benedict Arnold essentially builds a navy just from scratch, boats and everything.
Yeah, Arnold was in command of building a fleet on Lake Champlain, and Horatio Gates put him in charge of that. Um, and he had a couple of, I want to say, larger ships. They're not large by ship of the line standards or anything like that. They may have had like 10 or 15 cannons on them. And then he had a bunch of smaller gunboats, which are essentially a really big rowboat that could maybe hold 15 or 20 men, and they just like took a piece of rope and tied a big cannon to the front of it. And the idea was they'd row out, fire the cannon, and then quickly row away again while they reloaded, and then row back out again. So he had like maybe, I don't know, half dozen of those. Um, and he spends most of 1776 building this fleet and preparing for a British attack. The British had taken back Canada, but they kind of stopped at the Canadian border, and there General Carleton um, wants to build a fleet of his own so that he can have an overwhelming force on Lake Champlain and take back the lake and then take back Fort Ticonderoga. So he is building his own fleet of ships at the northern end of Lake Champlain. Some of these were like brought over from Britain as kits and then assembled on the lake. Some of the smaller boats were built from scratch, but he builds quite a formidable fleet. The problem is that it takes him all summer and most of the fall to get the fleet together. So Arnold's doing what he can during this time. He knows there's no way he can compete with this fleet. And Horatio Gates, who's at Fort Ticonderoga at this point, basically tells Arnold, well, just fight a retreating defensive fight, inflict as much as you can on the fleet as they're coming down toward the fort, and eventually you'll fall back to the fort and we'll make our last stand here. That was Gates's plan. Arnold said, yeah, that's stupid, I'm not doing that. So Arnold comes up with a plan of his own. He's been spending most of the summer sailing up and down Lake Champlain and learning every nook and cranny of the lake and what geographical points he can use for his own advantage. And there's one spot on the lake near a place called Valcour Island, uh, where the river basically goes around both sides of the island and then joins up again. But the western side of the island is very shallow and has a bunch of rocks. And you can't really run ships through the western side of the island. You can only run them around through the eastern side of the island. So Arnold's idea is that he'll put a bunch of ships like over on the western side, where there's enough water. He obviously can't go further upriver, but he can put his ships there so they're kind of hidden from the British, and the British will come down the lake, and then he'll come out from behind them. The British will obviously be moving down the lake when the wind is blowing in a southern direction, so Arnold will have the wind in his favor, and he'll be able to launch a surprise attack on the British, and that's exactly what he does.
Now, the British don't just let him attack, they return fire. My impression of the whole event is that technically it's a British victory, but Arnold is able to escape.
Right. Well, there's no question. Arnold, everyone goes into this battle knowing they're going to lose. Their goal is to inflict as much pain as possible on the British before they lose, because they're just completely outgunned. The British have like 10 times as many cannons. They have more ships. They have everything. They have like several hundred Indians in canoes that are controlling the coastline. It's just, there's no way Arnold's going to win this, and everybody knows that. But Arnold is his goal is to inflict as much pain as possible. And so the British fleet sails by him, and for a few minutes it looks like they're just going to keep on going and not even see Arnold's fleet hidden behind Valcour Island. So Arnold sends out one ship, fires a cannon or two, and then that ship dashes back. And he's like chained all of his ships in like this arc so that they can concentrate all their fire on whatever ship comes in. And it is a very narrow, shallow passage. So some of the bigger British ships can't get in there, and the smaller ships can really kind of only get in one at a time. One British ship goes in and gets blown to bits, and I'm not sure if it sinks, but it's really taken out of commission. They send in several smaller British gunships. They get hit really hard too. And so by the end of the first day, it's kind of an American success. The Americans have held their own, um, and but now kind of the game is over. The next morning, General Carleton, who is in command of the fleet, says that he's going to go in and just, you know, either blow away all those ships or accept their surrender. And there's really no way they can do anything else. There are Indians, as I said, on Valcour Island and along the coastline, so they can't just jump off their ships and try to run away, or they'll all be captured by Indians and probably die horrific deaths. So they're trapped. They can't escape out to the north, and the entire British fleet is to their south. So they're completely trapped and hemmed in, and they really don't even have enough gunpowder to put up much of a fight the next day. So they're stuck. And this is another time when Arnold, pulls victory out of the jaws of defeat. He decides to do somewhat of a daring plan, and he sails his ships in the dead of night very quietly right through the British fleet. So his ships are like passing right by the British and, just pretending to be friendly ships, moving very slowly and just kind of drifting by under the cover of darkness without any lights. And they managed to get far enough downriver so that by dawn, when General Carleton looks behind Valcour Island and finds no one there, he's just shocked. He's like, where the hell did this fleet go that just completely disappeared? And his immediate assumption is that they somehow got past those rocks to the north of the island and sailed up north and are now sailing up toward Quebec to wreak havoc there. So he immediately turns his fleet around and sails northward, trying to find Arnold's fleet. Of course, Arnold is sailing south as fast as he possibly can.
Right.
And speed is not a thing because most of his ships were really badly damaged in the fight the day before. A lot of them don't have sails, they have broken masts, they're leaking horribly, and they're just trying to bail out the water as fast as they can as they're sailing southward. It takes Carleton an entire day to realize that he's heading in the wrong direction. He sails back to Valcour Island and stays there for a second night before heading south. But this is kind of where Arnold's luck runs out. The wind turns against Arnold, his fleet's moving really slowly, and the British are able to catch up with him. And they take out one of the slower ships that can't really keep up with the rest of the fleet and just completely decimate it and capture the crew. Arnold sends some of the ships that are a little bit faster or in better condition with the wounded and sends them off to Ticonderoga while he continues to try to run a holding action to slow up the British fleet and allow the rest of his men to escape. And again, this is where Arnold's knowledge of Lake Champlain comes into effect. He knows that there's an area nearby that has relatively shallow waters that he can sail his ship into, and the British larger ships will be unable to follow. So when the British finally do catch up with him, he sails into this shallow area, takes all of his men off the ship, sets them on fire, and marches his men back to Fort Ticonderoga overland. And it's an amazing, it's as good a success as he could have possibly hoped for.
It's significantly better than anyone could have imagined.
Yeah.
Again, making his name as a hero of the Continental Army. Meanwhile, no one else is having any success anywhere else, because this is, Where are we now? 1770,
This is the
seven,
end of 1770s. This is December
76.
1776. Yeah.
Right.
Uh,
So, meanwhile, George Washington, well, to be fair, this is just before uh, uh, Trenton and Princeton.
right. This is like late November, early December. So Washington is still retreating across New Jersey, trying to escape the British under General Howe. Um, General Carleton was trying to take Fort Ticonderoga, and he actually reaches Fort Ticonderoga. He reaches Crown Point, which is about 10 miles away, and burns that to the ground. Or I think it was the Americans burned it and left it before he got there. He then gets to Fort Ticonderoga, and it begins to snow. And Carleton decides that he's not going to try to take the fort at this time of year. He's This is what Arnold succeeded in doing. He succeeded in delaying the British fleet from reaching Ticonderoga for the entire year. And they don't want to stick around because it's very possible that Lake Champlain will freeze over very soon, and then the fleet will be stuck right in front of a giant fort with lots of cannons, and that's not where you want to be. So Carleton sails back to um, Quebec and basically reports back to London that he's secured the lake and it'll be no problem to take Fort Ticonderoga in the spring.
Right. Because winter campaigns were very uncommon at this time.
Right, and especially in Canada at this time, it was just it gets cold up there. This is You think Canadian winters are cold now? They were much colder in the 18th century when we were in the middle of what was called the mini ice age.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, it was not something you wanted to get stuck in. So yeah, Carleton is not going to fight a winter campaign. He withdraws back to Quebec, um, and that's considered a big success by most Americans. Although the Continental Congress basically looks at this and says, "So Arnold, you fought a battle, you lost, your fleet was destroyed, and you had to retreat. Good job." They really give him a hard time for his accomplishments. Um, and so yeah, so
Yeah.
yeah,
But he
that
does
was
get the thanks of George. The one person who sticks with Arnold the whole time seems to be George Washington.
George Washington understands what he did and really respects it. And quite frankly, so do Horatio Gates and Philip Schuyler and anybody who's a real military man
Right.
understands.
Not those doctors and merchants and lawyers in Philadelphia. They don't know what they're talking about.
Right, right.
Yeah.
This,
Oh,
this,
but it
this.
gets worse.
Oh yeah, it always gets worse.
Yeah. But again, so the men themselves find him to be a hero, as do maybe not a hero, but his fellow officers definitely respect what he's doing. Now,
Yeah,
this is then the clock turns to 1777, and I believe it's pretty early in the year he's promoted to brigadier general.
yeah. He actually gets. I think he gets his promotion in 1776,
Is it?
and he is up for promotion in early 1777 to major general. And a whole bunch of other people get promoted over him. Um, Many of these men were not as senior to him um,
Yes.
as brigadiers. Um,
No,
and so he's
you're
very
right. I just pulled it up. It was before this, so January of 1776. So he has been a brigadier general
for a year, over a year.
throughout this entire campaign on the water.
Right. So he gets his brigadier after the Battle of Quebec. That's kind of his claim to fame
Okay.
at that point. Um, but there are a few men who are promoted to major general um, during 1776, and Arnold kind of accepts that they're more senior to him. He understands that even though he thinks he has a better combat record than they do, there are some politics involved and other things, and because of seniority, they get promoted ahead of him. He's okay with that. What happens in February of 1777 is a bunch of men who were junior to him get promoted to major general, and he's still stuck as brigadier general. In fact, he becomes the most senior brigadier general in the Continental Army because all the other brigadiers got promoted past him. So he is extremely unhappy about this. And he writes a letter to General Washington basically saying, you know, clearly Congress doesn't think I'm a capable officer. They're promoting other people ahead of me. I might as well just resign my commission and head back to Connecticut. And Washington's immediate reaction is, wait a minute, you were on the promotion list. There had to have been some mistake. Hang on. Let me make some inquiries, see what's going on.
Right.
And he contacts the Continental Congress, and the Congress basically says, no, we already have a few generals from Connecticut. We can't have another one. We have to, give these out to other states. Um, so, Washington kind of writes back to Arnold saying, well, yeah, apparently it wasn't a mistake, but really we do need you, and Congress is just being idiots. Please hang in there. Um, we'll, we'll we'll do something about this. But Arnold is kind of fed up, and he goes back to Connecticut. He doesn't resign his commission or anything, but he doesn't have a command either, and so he's kind of just back in Connecticut trying to decide what to do next.
Which most people, many generals resigned their commission over this kind of thing.
Yeah,
Most generals who were slighted, or not even generals, anyone who was slighted in this fashion at the time would have resigned their position. It's actually very unique that he doesn't.
yeah. David Wooster, who is another Connecticut general, who's actually a senior brigadier to Arnold, um, does submit his resignation around this time. There's some question about whether or not it was accepted.
Right.
But
As we said, there's a question about whether or not he was actually a brigadier in the
yeah,
first place.
but right. So the two of them who don't particularly like each other, or at least having this shared experience of thinking that Congress sucks and doesn't appreciate them.
Right.
So they're hanging out in Connecticut, and the British invade Connecticut in the Fairfield raid. And all of a sudden, Arnold and Wooster are there. They don't have an army with them. They're not in command of anything, but they're two capable combat officers. And so they immediately try to drum up a bunch of militia to fight against this British raid against Fairfield. And Arnold, um, both men show a great deal of bravery. Wooster, unfortunately, is fatally wounded during this battle and dies. Arnold is desperately trying to lead militia against a bunch of retreating British. The British had gone and raided Fairfield, and now they're trying to retreat back to their ships and make their escape. And Arnold is trying to push his militia to get forward, um, to attack the British. And the militia are kind of marching slowly and not too excited about charging headlong into British regulars. Arnold is very much in the front lines, the front of the front lines, and is actually shot by his horse is shot by the British, who then rush up, and a British soldier says, "You are my prisoner, sir." And I forget Arnold's exact words, but it's something like, "Not yet," and pulls out a pistol and shoots the guy in the head. Arnold, meanwhile, is trapped under his horse with a broken leg, and still manages to crawl away and avoid capture. But the result of his being shot is that his men, the militia, are unwilling to really go any further, and the British manage to escape. Even so, Arnold's daring and his willingness to take on British regulars with a bunch of militia that he knew nothing about, and his bravery in the field finally encourages Congress to promote him to Major General. You'd think this would make Arnold happy, but it doesn't. Um, Arnold goes from being the most senior brigadier general in the Continental Army to being the most junior major general in the Continental Army, which means everybody who could give him orders before can still give him orders.
Right. Absolutely nothing changed.
Nothing's changed. Arnold wants to be given retroactive seniority to be put ahead of this group of men that got promoted in February.
Right.
And for that, he's going to have to wait a few more months. And I think it's not until late 1777 that he finally gets, and it may even be after Saratoga, that he finally gets his retroactive seniority to become Major General.
Right. And these are just to let everyone know who we're talking about. There are some serious names that got promoted over him who next week we're going to have a conversation about the February 19th appointments, but it's Lord Stirling, William Alexander, Thomas Mifflin, Arthur Sinclair, Adam Stephen, and Benjamin Lincoln, all of whom either at this point or in the future had a big role in the war itself, or many of them in the Thomas Mifflin in particular becomes a president of the Continental Congress, um, and and St. Clair, well, his later career doesn't go so well. And
Yeah, he does the
Does
stuff,
Mifflin actually sign the Constitution?
who?
Mifflin, maybe not.
Uh, I'm not
No,
sure.
I shouldn't say that. I don't think so.
But from Arnold's position, what have these guys done so far? Really nothing. None of them have done any major battles. They've not really led anything. Um, Lincoln wasn't even a brigadier general in the Continental Army. He was still a militia officer in the Massachusetts Army. Uh, to be fair, he was a major general in the militia, but still. So Arnold's like, you're promoting all these nobodies, and you're basically doing it for affirmative action reasons. These guys are from places like New York and Pennsylvania that didn't have enough generals, and Connecticut had too many generals. And he thought that's a stupid way to
Yeah.
make promotions.
What's really interesting too is both Mifflin and Sinclair were from Pennsylvania. So two
Right.
guys from Pennsylvania got the position, but we can't have more than one from any state.
Well, no, Massachusetts or Connecticut already had several
Right.
major generals. Israel
That's true.
Putnam.
Putnam and Spencer, yeah.
Yeah. So Pennsylvania had none, and
Pennsylvania had none. I'm seeing that next to me. That's very strange.
at this point in the war, they're trying to make sure that Pennsylvania stays in the fight, that they're not going to just try to make a separate piece. And part of that was to give them some representation in the overall command. And it's the same thing with New York. They're trying to bring in some New York generals, and you see a few more Virginia officers being promoted. So, yeah, they're trying to, make the command look more like the percentages of soldiers that are actually in the army. Um, and Arnold just has the bad fortune of being from Connecticut. Everyone loves his record. Everybody thinks he's doing a good job. But, sorry, you're from the wrong state.
Right. We got Spencer and Old Putt who are like not doing much, kind of been cast to the side at this point. So Connecticut's major generals don't have the best records in
Yeah.
general. Sorry, I don't know if that counts as a pun. I didn't say it on purpose. Yeah. So from there, where are we? Okay. So he's a major general, and he's wounded again. And we are in mid 1776. What's next on Benedict Arnold's list?
Um, no, we're into 1777 now, right?
77. I'm sorry. Absolutely. Uh,
So he's heading up to Saratoga.
sure. Okay. So time passes. He goes back to Connecticut, as you said. Fairfield the raid on Danbury happens. Um, he's wounded. He goes back, recuperates for a while, and then what is it? Over the summer of 1777, he ends up going up to Saratoga.
Yeah, he recuperates in Connecticut for a time. He goes down to Philadelphia to kind of consult with members of Congress. One of the things Arnold never really did well was make good political allies within Congress, and he makes some attempt here, and he talks to people, but
Mhm.
he
Hey, I'm a
knows that
nice guy. What's up?
if he's going to win laurels, it's going to be in the field. So he goes and gets a command to go to um, New York, the New York area where General Burgoyne has been invading. General Burgoyne has already captured Fort Ticonderoga, which was supposed to be this, great defensive fort that nobody could ever take, and everybody seems to just take it without even really trying.
Yeah.
Um, and this is where General St. Clair gets into trouble. He um, is in command of the fort, but decides to retreat without even putting up a fight because he realizes that if he doesn't, he's going to be completely surrounded and his entire garrison captured.
For
And
which
so
he's later vindicated, so it's fine.
right, he's a well, you can say it's fine. He was acquitted at court martial, but he never gets a serious command ever again.
Well,
Uh,
not until the Northwest Indian War, but we're going to talk about St. Clair next week, so we'll get into that.
in the American Revolution, he does get
Right?
another
Yeah,
command.
fair enough.
And that
St. Clair literally
probably was
has,
best given to what
yeah,
happens to him
yeah,
later.
literally the worst defeat against Native Americans in U.S. history. It's called St. Clair's defeat.
Yeah.
So we'll get there next week.
And it's funny because Anthony Wayne ends up having to bail him out after that defeat.
Yeah,
And Sinclair, Anthony Wayne had been in charge of Fort Ticonderoga right before Sinclair took over. Sinclair only took over a couple weeks before the British attacked.
I never
So,
made that connection. That's amazing.
yeah.
That's an amazing point. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah,
Yes, but after the fall of Fort Ticonderoga, Philip Schuyler and Arthur Sinclair's military careers are essentially over.
right,
Both of them are acquitted in court martials, but that ends their military careers.
right.
Arnold, however, is still very much active, very much the hero. Um, there are a couple of things going on. You got Burgoyne, who's taking Fort Ticonderoga, and now he's trying to march his men southward toward the Hudson River, with his ultimate goal being to reach New York City. At the same time, there is another British force that was kind of sent out to the west and is kind of marching eastward to join up with General Burgoyne's army. They're going to hopefully meet up at Albany. Um, and this other force captures a fort known as Fort Stanwix. The Americans have called it Fort Schuyler, but for most of its life, it's known as Fort Stanwix. Um, they fight a major battle at the Battle of Oriskany,
Oriskany,
which
yeah.
is fought between mostly New York militia and
Barry St. Ledger is the
Barry St. Ledger is the general that's in command of this force, but the battle is actually mostly fought by Native Americans. I think by Joseph Brant in command, a Mohawk warrior who really is one of the fiercest fighters for the British, actually, of anybody
yeah,
on the British side. He just does some amazing stuff.
yeah,
But he does not do well at the Battle of Oriskany. And part of the problem is political. The British bring a bunch of the Indian warriors with them, um, saying that, oh, don't worry, we'll do most of the fighting. You guys, you're just along for the ride, basically. And then the British end up sending the Indians out to fight this Battle of Oriskany while the British hold the fort. The Americans manage to not only fight the Indians at the battle, but they managed to get into the Indians' camps and steal all their stuff or destroy it and chase off all their women and children who are with them. And this just really pisses off the Indians, and so they're ready to leave. Um, but they do hold Fort Stanwix, and
and that's when
but
Benedict Arnold shows up.
right, they're kind of halted in their advance, but they haven't gone anywhere. So Benedict Arnold hears about this and says, "All right, I'm going to go rescue Fort Stanwix," and he basically charges off without an army, just on his own, trying to
Again,
collect militia as he goes along, and
and he
uh,
does.
he uses a bit of trickery. There's this uh, person is captured who is accused of being a loyalist, a local New Yorker. He's described as a dim-witted guy who's has some mental issues and stuff like that. Um, and Arnold has him as a prisoner, and I think his wife, or not his wife, his mother and his brother come to like beg for him to be released. And Arnold says, "Well, I can't just release him, but if he does something for the cause, then yeah, then I'll release him." So um, they take his jacket and they shoot a bunch of bullet holes in it and they put it on him and they tell him to go to Fort Stanwix and say that Benedict Arnold's coming and he has an army of 3,000 men and he's gonna wipe you all off the face of the earth unless you all run away right now. And uh, say Ledger's a little skeptical. He wants to say, all right, well, let's see what he's got when he gets here. But the Indians are like, yeah, no way, we're not hanging around, especially after what you just did to us at Oriskany. And so the Indians not only run away, they actually raid the British camp and start stealing all the British soldiers' stuff to replace all the stuff that got destroyed by the Americans. And it ends up creating a complete panic. The entire force, the British, the militia, the Indians, all rush back to the lake where their fleet is, and
Yeah,
they
the Lake Ontario, and
yeah,
go back.
and they end up sailing back to Montreal. So Arnold has essentially single-handedly taken out this entire army and taken it out of commission, meaning that um, um,
Burgoyne.
not Barry Ledger, Burgoyne.
Burgoyne.
Burgoyne
I
is
see it.
going to be left without any reinforcements
Right.
when he's fighting the Battle of Saratoga. He was counting on getting all these reinforcements, and especially the Native Americans, which tend to strike terror into the New York militia. He was counting on having all those people with him, and he didn't, thanks to Benedict Arnold.
Almost literally single-handedly, yet again, does the impossible
Yeah.
and holds off the British. And
Yeah.
he goes back to meet everyone at Saratoga.
Right. So Arnold's feeling pretty good about himself, and he decides to butt heads with Horatio Gates, which Horatio Gates is having none of it. The two of them had a very serious falling out right after General Schuyler lost his command. Um, General Arnold took on two of Schuyler's aides de camp and made them part of his own personal staff. General Gates took this as a personal offense. Both of these men had badmouthed General Gates, and Gates wanted them both to be dismissed. Arnold said, no, they're good men. I'm going to keep them. I'm not going to play politics with this nonsense.
Yeah, their names are escaping me. Is one of them Henry Livingston? I have a feeling one of them is like future Supreme Court Justice, child of William Livingston, governor of New Jersey, brother-in-law of John Jay.
It could be. They were both prominent men. Their names are going to escape me at the moment, but I did write an episode about this on my podcast, and
No, I know it's, and I know I've heard the name. I'm listeners, don't quote me on this. I'm like 90% sure it's Livingston, but do continue.
But they were important men, and but anyway, so
And
yeah,
this has
Arnold.
caused a divide.
This creates this divide between Gates and Arnold, and Gates at this point basically wants to destroy Arnold's career to show him who's boss. Um, Gates has decided that what he wants to do is keep the the American army in these defended heights that they've built near Saratoga, and just wait for the British army to attack. The British really, he thinks, have nowhere to go because they can't really get past him to get to Albany any other way. I'm not quite sure why they couldn't just march around him, but he seems to think that this is a great defensive position. Arnold is very afraid that what they're going to do is run a flanking maneuver to the west, get around the American flank, and push them against the Hudson River and completely destroy the Continental Army. So he thinks it's a horrible position. Gates thinks it's a wonderful position and tells Arnold to pound sand. Arnold, when
I've never heard anyone use that phrase before.
I'm trying to keep it relatively clean.
No, it's fun. That's fun.
But so yeah, Arnold, the British do attack. Arnold wants to go on the offensive and take the battle to them. Gates basically says no, but you can do whatever you want with the few hundred men you have, including Daniel Morgan's riflemen. Fortunately, Arnold manages to really push the British back, kind of gets them pinned back, and almost does an effective job of capturing several hundred or even several thousand of the British during this battle. Calls on Gates to send him some reinforcements. Gates is like, nah, sorry, can't have any. I'm just going to sit here on my heights and do nothing. So it's kind of an American victory, but it could have been a much bigger victory if Arnold had some more support. So he and Gates get into it again. Gates decides, Arnold's saying, just give me a few more soldiers, I can win this thing. Gates says, okay, I'm going to take away some of your soldiers. And he takes away Daniel Morgan's riflemen and puts them over on the right flank of the Americans, whereas Arnold's commanding the left flank. Arnold and Gates get into it again. They get into this huge shouting match. There's this major blowout. They're basically just screaming at each other. Um, Gates basically tells Arnold that he's dismissed. His services are no longer required, and that if he has a problem, he should ride down to Philadelphia and take it up at the Continental Congress because he's not doing anything else at Saratoga. So Arnold kind of gets upset, does not leave the battlefield because he knows another big fight's coming. Um, the fight does come. Arnold tries to join the fight. Gates tells him under no circumstances are you to leave your tent. Arnold says, yeah, that's not going to happen, jumps on his horse and single-handedly charges off against the British. He joins up with the other soldiers that are already out there fighting this, including Daniel Morgan's riflemen.
And the men are
Manages to
like,
rally.
there he is.
Right. So he rallies a
Yay.
whole bunch of troops. He's, by some accounts, they say he's running around like a madman. Some people are saying he's acting like he's drunk. And I think these are mostly Gates partisans who are trying to put him in the worst possible light. But he's charging up and down and between the two lines of the Americans and the British, trying to rally the Americans to charge, and actually does a pretty effective job at completely routing the British and effectively blunts the British charge and forces the British to withdraw. And that's the Second Battle of Saratoga. And after that, Burgoyne is pretty much out of options. He retreats for a couple of days, but ends up eventually having to surrender. And it's all thanks to Arnold. And of course, Gates gives Arnold zero credit in all of his reports. He says, this was a joint effort by lots of people. And he mentions a couple of others, doesn't mention Arnold at all. So Arnold is really getting zero credit for this entire thing.
And he sends his own aide de camp, James Wilkinson, who's just 20 years old and gets breveted as a brigadier general, basically just for bringing the letter.
Yeah, it's traditional to give a promotion to the officer who brings it. So Gates very much picked Wilkinson with the expectation that this 20-year-old kid would be made a brigadier general. Wilkinson takes 2 months to get to Philadelphia. I don't know if it's quite that long, but he takes forever to bring the news to Philadelphia. In the meantime, the word arrives from other people, and Wilkinson is spending time stopping to chat with other officers and talk to other people.
He courts a Biddle woman.
Yeah, goes. Yeah, is trying to go on some dates and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, and I did just recently release a whole video on James Wilkinson. So viewers, you could definitely check that out if you want to know more about the double agent working for the Spanish while being the senior officer of the U.S. Army during the John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison administrations.
Yeah, he's a dirtbag his entire career.
He's a slippery character. But I do want to note, speaking of aides de camp, I did pull up, it was Henry Brockholst Livingston, who would very shortly thereafter join John Jay as secretary to Spain, and later become an associate justice on the United States Supreme Court. So, points for me for remembering that name. Also, his father, William Livingston, was governor of New Jersey for 20 years and voted for independence, but left before they signed the document. Anyway, back to Arnold.
You know who the other guy was?
No.
We just looked up Livingston.
I wish I did. The name Moses Hazen keeps coming to mind, but I know for a fact that's not true.
Yeah, no, Arnold was not going to stand by Moses Hazen.
No, we spoke about him earlier. I really wish I wish I did, but I can't.
I think it was a Dutch name, but I'm not going to remember it now.
Oh, it might have been Ben Sheikh.
That might be right. I don't know. I don't want to
No,
waste too
yeah,
much.
yeah, we can't get off on this. I am definitely gonna look it up though after we're
But
done.
anyway, yeah. So Arnold has just won Saratoga. Gates gets credit for Saratoga, um, and Arnold is actually badly wounded in the battle. Um,
Oh yes, wound number 3.
yeah, and this is a very serious one. He's actually laid up for I think a good 6 months trying to heal, and the doctors are trying to amputate his leg on numerous occasions. He will absolutely not allow them to do it. So he's going through multiple painful surgeries. His leg, his injured leg ends up being like 3 inches shorter than his other leg. So he's walking with a horrible limp for the rest of his life. And he's just feeling really dejected at this point because, he's won the war several times over in several different occasions and is getting like almost zero credit for this in his own mind.
He is,
Uh,
and again, people hate when I call him an American hero. At this point, in going into the end of 1777, going to early 1778, Benedict Arnold is the hero of the American Revolution. Like the Continental Congress might not realize it. It sounds like George Washington kind of realized it. Uh,
George Washington thought he was one of his most reliable and capable combat generals.
like he
And I
is he is
think,
over and over and over and over and over again been victorious when he absolutely should not have been.
right, he's always fighting against the odds. He's always coming out much more successfully than anybody thinks he should. And yeah, he's continually impressing other officers, even people who don't like him personally. Got to give him some credit for some of the amazing military feats that he's pulled off.
Except
Uh,
Gates.
well, yeah, Gates won't publicly give him any credit, and there's probably a lot of people who would never publicly give him credit because they think he's an asshole. But
he was. He was
personally, he
total.
was. But you're right. If he, I've said this before, if he had died at Saratoga rather than being badly wounded, I think he would have gone down as one of the greatest generals, not only in the American Revolution, but probably of American history.
Absolutely.
Um, he was just so successful. And really, a lot of the great things he did in these first 3 years of the war are downplayed later because of the horrible things he did. People just don't want to give him credit
Right.
in history for all of his successes,
Right.
and
But
fairly so. The stuff he does is pretty scummy, which we're going to get to in a few minutes.
right, right, yeah, yeah. What everyone who clicked on this video knows is coming. Um,
Yeah,
I know you do it a lot on your podcast. I try to do it here too. Is really giving Arnold all the credit he deserves adds weight to the impact of the treason itself. To downplay what he had done is, I mean, a lot of people committed treason, but he is the guy. Like, I think I heard you say that it's basically like, it's like if what General Patton during World War II just,
yeah. Imagine General Patton in 1944 decide, you know what, I'm going to go join the German army because I want to go fight Russians.
yeah,
You know, that
yeah,
would just be so shockingly, crazy.
right. Like, I know
But
we
that's almost
almost
what they
won
said.
here, but I really want to be a Nazi right now. I probably shouldn't say that on YouTube. Get me canceled.
I'll
But
get you taken out of context. It'll be
oh
fun.
that's a clip. There, someone's gonna cut that out and put it all in here. But yeah, so anyway, Arnold's laid up for months and months. No one cares that he's an American hero. And um, as he recovers, George Washington realizing like he can't really be a field commander. Like we had mentioned how Nathaniel Greene walked with a limp, and that inhibited him a bit in his early career. Uh, what Arnold's dealing with is well more than a limp, and
Yeah,
therefore,
Arnold is still really recovering in the spring of 1778. He spends a few months in Connecticut, actually, gets to see his kids a few times. We never mentioned that his wife passed away, I think, while he was at Ticonderoga or part of that campaign.
that's a good point.
And his sister was raising his children during this whole time. But he does get to go back to Connecticut for a
We
little while
also
and
forgot
recuperate.
I'm sorry to
Okay.
interrupt, but Christian Despina pointed out that when Joseph Warren died, uh, Benedict Arnold paid his wife and children a whole lump sum of money out of his own pocket because the Continental Congress wasn't supporting him. So he wasn't all bad.
No, and he had actually put up a lot of his own personal money to finance all these campaigns over the last 3 years, expecting to be reimbursed by the Continental Congress at some point. And Congress like to play all these games like, you don't have receipts, well, you don't get paid. Well, Arnold had a trunk full of receipts on the ship at Valcour Island that got sunk. And he's like, my ship got sunk in combat. You're really not going to pay me for the freaking receipts that are
Right.
at the bottom of Lake Champlain?
And now he's
Stuff like
essentially
that.
bankrupt.
Right. So he was a very wealthy man at the beginning of the revolution, and he had sacrificed his fortune for the cause of American independence and liberty. Um, and Congress was basically saying, yeah, well, maybe you did, maybe you didn't. I don't see any receipts. And they weren't paying him back for anything. And not only had he spent his own money, he would and this was a common practice, he would borrow from local merchants on his personal credit, promising that they would be paid back by the Continental Congress later. And if Continental Congress didn't, he would be legally on the hook for it. And so he is actually heavily in debt at this point because of promises he's made on behalf of the Continental Congress, and Continental Congress is just not helping him out. So, right, he's lost his wife, he's lost his fortune, he's lost his essentially use of his leg, all in the service of his country, and you know nobody seems to be giving him much gratitude over it.
Except George Washington, who finds the one of the few things you could do with a man in his condition: give him Philadelphia.
Right, Arnold shows up at Valley Forge in the spring after this horrible winter, and wants to do something. Everybody realizes he's not ready to go back into the field and lead troops, which they'd all love him to do, but he's just really not in the condition to do that. So they make him the military commander of Philadelphia. The British have just have have held the city of Philadelphia for nearly a year, occupied it. It's a huge mess. They've now retreated back across New Jersey to New York, and somebody needs to take command of the city and you know bring it back under American control, and more importantly, um, take control of all the supplies and stuff that the British have left behind that the Continental Army desperately needs. So Washington tasks Arnold with that, gives him, I think, maybe like a regiment of men, not a whole lot, but enough to just go in and take control of the city.
Police the
And
city.
Arnold marches in like on the same day that the British march out. I mean, he takes immediate control of the city and becomes the military governor.
And he puts himself up in a nice house, as he was
Arnold
accustomed
decides
to.
that it's time to start living the good life. I've put in my time, I've put in my hardships, and now I want to start, what's in it for me.
Right.
Um,
And we should note that he is a military governor, but he's a governor, and traditionally these had been royal governors. Um, Now, I know it's not the whole state of Pennsylvania, but Philadelphia was the capital at the time, and many people would have thought that the governor should be living a certain lifestyle.
yeah, it was expected that a governor would live a good lifestyle. And in addition to trying to get back a fortune, Arnold also kind of wants to rebuild his family life. He had been hitting on a girl in Boston for the last year or two. And I say girl because she was like 14 or 15 years old. That's a little creepy by today's standards.
I feel like
But
it was a little creepy by that day's standards as well.
well, it was a lot more common back then.
Yeah.
But he ended the parents of this girl ended up not letting her um, be around Arnold, and unfortunately, I'm getting onto a side story here, but she did fall in love with another man who also her parents wouldn't let her marry, and she ended up being a spinster and
Ooh,
leading this horrible, lonely life. But anyway, um, Arnold starts looking for an older woman, so he goes for 17-year-old Peggy Shippen. Um, he is, as I said, he's the governor of Pennsylvania at this point, the military governor. He puts himself up in the Penn Mansion, which was um, had been the home of Lieutenant Governor Richard Penn before the war. It's a very prominent house. It's one that Robert Morris later purchased, and it became the Philadelphia White House for George Washington. It's that same home. General Howe, when he occupied the city, lived there. So it's one of the most prominent houses. It's like right across the street from Independence Hall. Real nice
Right.
big mansion.
It makes sense that this is the house he would choose,
Yeah, I mean, why not? It's
unless
vacant at
you're
this
one of his enemies.
Well, here's part of the problem. One of the things Arnold had to do as soon as he took over the city was secure all the property in the city, including things were like stored in warehouses and stuff like that. And the idea was anything that was property of the British Army or belonged to known Tories could be seized and used by the Continental Army. And anything that was owned by good patriots would be seized by the Continental Army and paid for with script. But basically, the Continental Army needed a whole lot of stuff, and there was a whole lot of stuff there, and Arnold's job was to secure it. And he actually did a pretty good job of doing that. And anything that was of use to the Continental Army, he got to the Continental Army. There was also a whole lot of other stuff that was really of no particular use to the Continental Army: furniture, luxury goods, stuff like that. Arnold decides, I can help myself to this stuff. And basically, what he does is, according to his instructions, he does not allow anything to leave the city of Philadelphia. And he also does not allow anything to be bought or sold because they're trying to get to the bottom of who owns what and to decide, um, what the army wants. Um, what Arnold ends up doing is going to a bunch of Tories whose all their stuff is going to be completely seized by the new Patriot government and says, "Hey, you got a lot of nice stuff here. We're going to take it from you next week. But if you sold it to me for 10 cents on the dollar, then it would be owned by a Patriot and it couldn't be seized. So would you like 10 cents on the dollar or would you like nothing?" And so most people would sell to Arnold, and he got a lot of really nice stuff really cheap. And he furnished his Penn mansion, and he started driving around in a coach and four and buying some really nice studs, and was seen riding around town with young Peggy Shippen, who, by the way, is the daughter of a family that's suspected loyalists. Um, and he starts
Some of them.
Yeah, well, he starts hobnobbing with people who are suspected to be loyalists, and not just the Shippen family, but others, because they're the most prominent families in Philadelphia. They're the ones who, managed to come out on top during the American occupation and the British occupation, and now they're trying to do very well in the new American occupation. And there's a whole lot of Philadelphia radicals who want these people, a lot of them, they just want to be hanged or they want their property seized. They want to see these people suffer because these are everybody else is sacrificed horribly in the cause of the patriots, and these people are looking out for number one. They're trying to maintain their properties and playing nice with whichever side um, they can. Um, it was during this time that the Pennsylvania Supreme Council actually hanged several Pennsylvanians as traitors for their actions during the occupation by the British. So there was really a lot of hard feelings at this time, and a lot of them really wanted to see all this stuff seized. And Arnold was essentially acting as their protector. He was giving them political cover, social cover, and military protection from these Pennsylvania radicals who wanted to just destroy these people. So Arnold was very quickly becoming an enemy of the Pennsylvania state government, which at this time was run by
Joseph Reed.
Joseph Reed. Thank you. Gosh, my names are falling for me today. Joseph Reed was at one time an aide de camp to George Washington. They had a falling out when Reed kind of backed Charles Lee over Washington. But Reed went on to actually do some pretty impressive stuff. He was involved in the Trenton and Princeton campaigns, and then he got into politics. And by December of 1778, he was president of the state of Pennsylvania, essentially. He was the head of the Supreme Council and what we would today consider governor, but Pennsylvania was its own country at the time, and he had the title of president. And
And he thought
he,
he was in charge of Philadelphia.
well, not only that, but he became a real enemy of Benedict Arnold because he thought Arnold was being corrupt by getting all this, cheap goods, and he also thought Arnold was playing too nice with the loyalists in the town, and so you know, and he was right on both counts. Arnold was kind of being corrupt,
Yeah.
and Arnold was playing nice with the loyalists. Although really, the Continental Congress in Washington wanted Arnold to play nice with the loyalists. The goal was to bring Philadelphia back to a sense of normalcy as quickly as possible, not to take a whole bunch of retributive acts against people. They wanted Philadelphia to be functioning and to be building and producing goods that the Continental Army needed, and to get them back to work as quickly as possible. To do that, you needed the leaders of the city to remain the leaders, even if they had been playing nice with the British Army during the occupation. So Arnold was doing what the Continental Congress and what George Washington wanted him to do. But the Pennsylvania state government had very, very different ideas about what should be done. And Arnold was the face of this policy, and they held it against him. And they couldn't go after him for that, but they could go after him for corruption. That corruption was not part of the Continental Congress's policy. And actually, at a time when everybody was kind of suffering and going through deprivation, anybody that was trying to look out for number one at the time was looked at very poorly. You have to remember during this same period, you have Silas Deane being horribly accused by the Continental Congress of somehow profiting from his time in France, and he was spending the year of 1778 and early 79 trying to defend his reputation. And Arnold really is enriching himself from his position. Um,
Right.
and
So
so this is becoming more and more of a problem for him.
Silas Deane and Benedict Arnold they do totally different worlds of the American Revolution, but very similar uh, storylines.
Well, I think Silas Deane actually stays with Benedict Arnold for a time during this period when Arnold is governor of Philadelphia. And
I mean, Arnold respects success, right? And
yeah, and well,
Silas Deane returned with acknowledgement from France that America was a country, an ambassador, and the might of the French Navy. Oh, not to get too far off track. I think
right,
you, as well as I, are.
yeah, well,
I'm a Silas Deane apologist with unabashedly.
no, yeah, I'm definitely Team Dean. Um, but Dean basically tells Arnold, Congress is completely screwing me. I did all these wonderful things for them, and now they're basically saying, sorry, no receipts, no reimbursements. By the way, we think you probably stole millions of dollars, so we're going to make you figure all that out. And, you're basically having to live in the city at your own expense and not being able to do anything while we just hold these endless hearings that literally went on for more than a year.
Right. And
So
again,
Arnold is
just
seeing the
like
way,
Arnold lost his receipts on the ship,
yeah.
Dean left
So
his in France.
right. So Arnold is seeing the way others are being screwed by the Continental Congress, and he keeps thinking for himself, well, okay, I got to look out for number one. And so that's why he's trying to, make some coin here. He gets married in April. So he's got a new wife to support. He wants to buy her a big mansion, um, you know, have her live in the lifestyle to which she's accustomed. During the British occupation, um, Peggy Shippen's father complains to her that she has spent, and this is in inflation adjusted numbers, but she has spent about $1 million on clothing in 1 year during the British occupation. So that's the kind of lifestyle that she's used to living. Um,
Sounds really attractive.
Yeah. So, Arnold has got this nice, well, she's 18 by the time they get married, but this nice young girl who's used to being pampered and living in a really nice lifestyle. And he's this old, what, late 40s, early 50s curmudgeon at this point.
Well,
So
no, at this point, he's only he's still in his late 30s. When's his birthday? 1740?
is it?
1741.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I guess.
He's my age. Spoiler alert. He's my age.
Oh,
Like,
that'll.
I mean, he's still, yes, he's marrying a much younger woman, but he's still only in his late 30s, having accomplished all of this.
Yeah, I guess it's more the mileage than the years.
I
He's
know.
he's
Well, that's I know
a
what you
pretty
mean because
broken down
I
man.
actually looked it up just before we started today because I felt you feel like he's really old because I
Yeah,
mean
you feel like he's an old man at this
we've been
point.
speaking for almost 2 hours and we haven't even gotten to the treason because he's done so much.
But yeah, his body has taken such a beating over the
Yeah,
last few
dude,
years.
his leg's been mangled 3 times.
Yeah, but
But
so yeah, but he buys a big house, mortgages everything very heavily, and is going through all this stuff. But he's basically trying to build a life for himself in Philadelphia now.
right, and then Joseph Reed et al. um, decide to throw some accusations at him. But I do want to note that actually, and I learned this a few months back, and I've never heard anyone talk about it, but I read it in some of his letters. Uh, Benedict Arnold decides to leave Philadelphia and resign his position, and he leaves for New York. He wants to go to the state of New York. Is expecting him so that he can buy a whole huge property of land in upstate New York, probably around where I live in central New York, that he then wants to parcel out and sell to his soldiers, or at least give to his soldiers as a reward for payment, because he doesn't seem to think, imagine this, that the Continental Congress is actually going to pay these soldiers who've been fighting for years. Now, this
Well,
never
this is a
happens.
this is a for-profit scheme. He is hoping to make money from this deal, but
Yeah.
yeah, he's this is a whole bunch of loyalist lands that were seized in upstate New York. General Schuyler is actually running the whole land
Oh,
deal.
you're
And
aware of this.
yeah, and he lets Arnold in
Okay.
on it. And Arnold is, yeah, he actually does not resign his governorship, but he does leave Philadelphia and he's headed up to New York. And he stops in Morristown, New Jersey to spend some time with George Washington. And it's there that he gets a message um, from an express rider from Philadelphia saying, by the way, you've been brought up on criminal charges in Philadelphia. You must return immediately. And so he's really ticked off because essentially what Reed did was wait until Arnold left the city, then bring all these charges, have them all published in the newspaper, and it looks like Arnold has run off because he's not in town anymore.
Right. Great.
So yeah, Arnold talks about it with Washington. Washington says, yeah, you got to go back and deal with this right away. Don't let it get out of control. Arnold seems to think Washington is um, very much in favor, on his side still. Washington is always wants to be neutral in these things and not look like he's backing friends in anything that might have the appearance of corruption in it. But Arnold still thinks Washington has his back, and he goes back to Philadelphia to address these charges. And he actually gets most of them dismissed because most of them are nonsense.
But he does get a reprimand.
Well, what happens is they decide that Philadelphia cannot try him and that he should be tried by a court martial. And it ends up being almost another year before he gets uh, actually has the court martial. They find him not guilty of most of the charges, but he is um, found like guilty of like misuse of federal property because he used some wagons to cart some of his personal haul to safety at one point. Um,
But the
so
reprimand I was referencing comes
so
from General
there's some
Washington.
very minor ethics charges, and the court martial orders General Washington to issue him a reprimand.
which is super lightly worded.
Arnold is kind of hoping that, he won't issue at all, or he'll basically say really nice things about him in it and then say, but, you know, I'm ordered to give you a reprimand, so here it is.
Right.
Um, Washington does really look at what Arnold's done and say, yeah, you really shouldn't have done this. It's not appropriate. You did something that's wrong. So Arnold takes great. Uh, he feels like Washington no longer has his back. Like Washington is turning his back on him now too.
Which, like,
Um,
Washington was, we've been saying this whole time, at every turn, whenever he was given crap, it was Washington who was like, yeah, they're terrible, but come on.
Now, some people say that this was really the turning point when Arnold decided to switch sides when Washington turned his back. Arnold had actually already been in discussions with Major Andre for several months by this time, so he was already heading down that road. Um,
So just to glance over that, and I think a lot of people are familiar with it. The TV show Turn has a lot of errors, but has the Arnold conversation is one of the more, I don't want to say accurate, but well, I'll say more accurate than some of the other things in that particular show. It's largely his spouse and her family had an association with Major Andre, and I believe that's. I'm getting lost in my own thoughts.
yeah, Major Andre was um, I forget what his actual title was within the Army at this point, but one of his roles was to try to see if he could turn some American officers. And they didn't just go after Arnold, they went after several high ranking officers, including, I think we mentioned General Sullivan
Yeah.
last week, and there were a few others that they were trying to turn at this point. Um,
Most of them said no way. One guy,
but yeah, um, Arnold, Major Andre and Peggy Shippen had known each other during the British occupation. They had gone to some parties together, much to Peggy's father's chagrin. He really did not want that to happen. Um, the TV show Turn shows Major Andre kind of carrying a torch and still madly in love with Peggy Shippen. I don't think that was the
no.
case. He was more of a kind of love him and leave him officer. He had a good time with her, and I don't mean to imply he did anything inappropriate, but they had a good time together, and he moved on with his
Right.
life. But that was a connection, and there is some evidence that Peggy may have helped Andre and Arnold get in touch with each other, and Peggy was basically filling Arnold with ideas that, you're such a great general, you could, you're so unappreciated by the Continental Army, and she had a point, a good point to make there. He really was unappreciated. Um,
Yeah,
so
you're right, Peggy. You're absolutely right.
yeah, Arnold decides to betray his country. And he enters into very specific negotiations with Andre as to what he's going to get. The British are going to pay him for all the money that the Continental Congress had owed him, but wasn't going to pay him. They're going to pay him for all the property that he's going to have to abandon and is going to be seized by the Americans when he switched sides. And they're also going to pay him because he agrees to turn over West Point to the British. West Point is at this point a very valuable fort on the Hudson River that's kind of seen as the key to control of um, the area. The British for years have been trying to take control of the Hudson Valley so they could cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. They thought that was the key to victory for some reason.
It's like Ticonderoga South.
Yeah, so the Americans have built this new fortress at West Point over the last few years. It's considered this great impregnable thing that will definitely keep the British from ever being able to move up the Hudson River and do any kind of effective military action there. So Arnold gets the idea, all right, well, I'll get the command of West Point. You'll march an army out to attack me, and I will surrender to you and hand it over to you. And then you get West Point without a fight. So Washington, after issuing the reprimand to General Arnold, wants to immediately go about rehabilitating Arnold's reputation and wants to give him a new combat command and put him out in the field and really, you know, regain his reputation with a few more military victories. That's kind of Washington's goal for Arnold. But Arnold tells him, I'm still, my leg is still a problem. I can't do much. Just give me the command of West Point. He specifically asks for West Point as Washington is kind of surprised by this. He would think Arnold wants to get back into combat and rehabilitate his reputation, but he says, "Okay, Arnold, you're one of my senior officers. If you want this position, you can have this position." And so he hands over West Point to Benedict Arnold.
And that's that. Benedict Arnold goes up there. Um, my understanding is the final. Andre goes up to negotiate the final deal.
Yeah, Benedict
in
Arnold goes
person.
up there. He does like a really. Several people have noted that he's like doing a terrible job. He's not building up the defenses around the fort. He's letting everything kind of fall apart, which is what he wanted to do because he wants the British to come in and take it. Um, and yeah, Major Andre comes up on a ship up the Hudson River, the Vulture, to make kind of some final arrangements with Arnold, and Arnold hands him over some plans of West Point defenses and things like that to take back to New York to share with General Clinton. Um, and they're getting ready to, make this whole thing happen. Um, and then it all falls apart. Uh, Andre, the ship that brought Andre up, gets chased off by some Americans who see the ship there, and so Andre is kind of stuck near West Point in his British uniform. So he puts on an overcoat to hide the fact that he's a British soldier and tries to ride back down the Hudson River to the British lines in New York. Um, this area is filled with a whole bunch of like ruffians and criminals, and you know you're never quite sure who you're going to meet in
Yeah,
this.
ne'er do wells.
So they somebody ends up capturing Andre, and they realize quite quickly that he's a British officer, and they find the plans in his boots, and they turn him over to the Continentals for arrest. And they immediately send word to the commander at West Point that they've captured this British spy. So Benedict Arnold receives a notice saying, "Guess what? We just captured Benedict. We just captured Major Andre. What do you want us to do with him?" And he goes, "Oh shit." Uh, he basically jumps on a horse and rides away as fast as he can for the British lines. Um, and it just so happens that George Washington is arriving at West Point around the same time, and he goes to meet Benedict Arnold, and everybody's like, "Oh, yeah, he was here just a minute ago. Where'd he go?" Um, and it very quickly turns out that this whole thing unravels, and Peggy Arnold, his wife, is still there at West Point. She's pregnant, and Arnold just kind of abandoned her. And so Peggy has a complete freak out, and no one's quite sure whether she really did freak out or whether this was an act. But she basically screams at Washington that Arnold has left me behind. Now you're going to execute me and kill my unborn child. And she's screaming in hysterics. And Washington just freaked out by this whole thing. She's like, okay, calm down, lady. Nothing's going to happen here.
Yeah. I don't want to
And
deal with you. I just had the most significant
yeah,
change of uniform
yeah.
in
And
history.
Washington's still trying to deal with this idea that,
Yeah.
General Patton just joined the Nazi army. What the hell just happened?
Yeah, like,
I have no idea what's going on.
yeah, Arnold, he's the hero. His
Yeah,
leg. Like,
right. American hero. You're telling me an American hero just made
yeah.
plans with the British to join the British Army and turn over, 3,000 American troops at West Point to the enemy. He's just, he finds this unfathomable. Um, he ends up sending Peggy back to New York. He just doesn't want to deal with the crazy lady. And so she's allowed to rejoin her husband behind the British lines. But Washington really wants Arnold back. He wants him to stand trial and hang. This is completely unacceptable that
Yeah.
somebody would attempt something like this. And so
Desertion is one thing. Like Washington executed people for desertion,
yeah,
and this is far beyond that.
so he wants to exchange Major Andre for Arnold, and Clinton won't allow it. He's made a deal with Arnold, and he's not going to go back on that deal just because he wants to get back one of his other officers who did something he never should have done. He never should have worn a civilian cloak. He was actually warned specifically not to do that. Um, so, yeah, instead of Arnold, Major Andre is tried and hanged, and that's the end of Major Andre.
Right.
And Benedict Arnold is now a brigadier general in the British Army. He's a British regular with a formal and ready to lead troops against the Americans.
Oh yeah, he's ready to take the field, despite what he told Washington. He's very much ready to take the field. Um, the first thing, the first thing they have him do, well, actually, the first thing he does is give up, um, Hercules Mulligan, who has recently become very popular because of the play Hamilton. He gives up Hercules Mulligan as a spy. Somehow Mulligan is able to talk his way out of it, but I do want to throw that in there. um, Before they end up giving him a command and sending him down south.
Right. He leads some raids in Virginia. Um,
Well, he actually takes Richmond. He's the one in charge of when they invade, like Thomas Jefferson, Governor Jefferson, and the Virginia House of Virginia government evacuates the capital
right.
because Benedict Arnold is here and he means business. He's not effing around, as they say, and they evacuate.
Right. He does a very serious raiding across Virginia. He doesn't have enough troops to really occupy any part of the state, but he leaves a whole swath of devastation across the state of Virginia.
Right. Which again, you hear about Benedict Arnold here. He committed treason. He left, but we forget to mention he literally fought. Because after that, he moves up to returns to Connecticut. Just about the time George Washington wants to turn south for Yorktown, they do several maneuvers attempting to keep Washington in the north, so that doesn't happen. One of which is sending Benedict Arnold to his hometown of
New London.
New London. Thank you. I knew it was an
Yeah.
N. I almost said Norwich. It's his hometown. And there is the Battle of, sometimes called the Massacre at Fort Griswold.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, to be fair, and you know a little bit more about the military strategy than I do, so correct me if I'm wrong here, but the Thames River, not in Britain, in Connecticut, New London is on one side with a fort, and then Fort Griswold is on the other side. Arnold leads men into New London, and there are other men technically under his command, but a different operation, theoretically, goes up to Fort Griswold, where when and the name of the man in charge is escaping me, I feel bad, but they offer surrender to the British, and instead of letting them surrender, they just slaughter everyone. Oh, the Battle of Groton Heights is what it's called. They basically just slaughter everyone, including the officer who's trying to surrender, which ends up becoming a rallying cry during the Battle of Yorktown, one of many martyrdoms at that time. Though to be fair, I understand once Benedict Arnold makes it to the fort and sees what happens, he severely reprimands the officers who let that atrocity take place.
Right. And, that was not entirely unusual. This sort of thing did happen on quite a number of occasions. So, but yeah, because Benedict Arnold was in charge of the overall raid, he gets a lot of blame. I mean, not like anybody liked him anyway, but at this
Right,
point.
right. Yeah, and again, that's despite the like he wasn't really a monster. And he did believe in order in the army in that nature, where he was like, you can't be doing that. William Ledyard, it just dawned on me, is the gentleman
Okay.
who was trying to hand over his sword, and the British didn't want his sword and wanted him dead. And then I'm pretty sure that's the end of Arnold, because shortly thereafter Yorktown happens. So the American Revolution, for all intents and purposes, the hostilities conclude.
Right. And yeah, a couple of months after Yorktown, Arnold, who was in British occupied New York at the time, heads for London with his family.
And that it doesn't go as well as he might hope. He goes to London for a while. He ends up going to Canada. He buys a bunch of land in Canada. Tries to set up a shipping business. He gets in a bunch of lawsuits because he's Benedict Arnold, and at this point, no one trusts him. Because even if you commit treason to switch to my side, I still know you committed treason. um, so you're
Yeah.
not a trustworthy character. Uh, and then I understand. So that happens. He sets up a merchant firm between Canada and the Caribbean.
Yeah, he actually goes back to Canada with General Carleton when Carleton is replacing General Clinton. Um, and right, that's when he heads up to Canada just to try this whole mercantile business, which yeah, he ends up getting sued, and yeah, it becomes a huge mess.
Yeah, well, that was his career before the revolution, but
Right.
now years later, obviously doesn't have it anymore. He ends up. I know he goes back. He goes back and forth to London and Canada. I think Peggy runs into some trouble with money, spending lavishly.
Yeah, they're spending lavishly and they're living on a general's half pay at this point, which is not a whole lot of money. Um,
Not for that kind of clothes.
no, for a commoner that would be fine, but not for Peggy. Um, he's not really accepted into London society. He always kind of looked at as a turncoat and a traitor. He actually has a duel, I think, with a member from the House of Lords at one point, um, someone who questioned his honor. Uh,
Imagine that.
yeah, imagine questioning General Arnold's honor. So he kind of lives for quite a few years in London without really doing much. He during the war with France in the 1790s, he gets a little bit more of an adventure. He tries to start a privateering outfit and outfits a ship and goes off to try to see if he can loot some French ships. That does not go particularly well.
Yeah.
No, he's actually captured at one point, I think.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that. He's like captured and they're gonna hang him,
Yeah,
but he like bribes his guards
yeah, and manages to
and
escape.
like escapes an island to some British ships.
Yeah,
Yeah, Benedict Arnold's life is fascinating. It's extraordinary. And then he goes back and from there on out, just kind of fades away. His wound, his leg wound, never heals. And eventually he's barely even mobile. I think he had gout in that same injured leg as well.
he had gout his whole life, and yeah, it really
Yeah,
got bad when he got older. But yeah, so
and
yeah,
then
he had all his war injuries. He had gout. He had a whole bunch of problems.
right, and then he passes away in 1801. So just after Thomas Jefferson becomes president,
Right.
Benedict Arnold dies.
He's only 60 years old. He passes away, and Peggy remains in London her whole life. His sons actually go on to become British officers in the army and actually have pretty interesting military careers of their own.
Yeah, we're not going to get too much into that tonight, but yes, you're absolutely right. And then there is the one thing about his deathbed, where allegedly he says something, and I'm paraphrasing here, but something along the lines of, "Put me in my old Patriot uniform. I should have never worn another."
Yeah, he has claimed to have said something like that. We don't know if it's true or
I don't believe
apocryphal.
it at all.
Uh, Yeah, he's buried in the basement of St. Mary's Church in London in an unmarked grave, and it's basically forgotten. And it was only like a couple hundred years later, I think, maybe 150 years later or something, that a, a, a fellow, someone from Connecticut, finds out that he's buried in this unmarked grave and actually builds a fairly nice memorial for him at St. Mary's Church, which is still something you can see today.
That's fascinating. Well, speaking of memorials to him, what's really interesting is at the Saratoga battlefield they have that four-sided monument with the main leaders of the battle, one on each side, and three sides have someone's likeness and their name and information on it, and the fourth side is blank.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think there's just like a boot there or something.
Yeah, which I think is the absolute best way to go about it because, in a fashion, they're acknowledging there was someone else here who was extraordinary. And at the same time, we don't like to talk about that guy.
Right. That's the thing. They kind of have to erase all of his good deeds from the early part of the war from the public memory
Right.
because he's not a hero anymore. He's a traitor. He tried to destroy the United States, and he actually, was willing to turn on his fellow soldiers, all for making some money.
Right.
So whatever heroism he did in the early part of the war is just completely wiped out, and people just kind of want him to be forgotten.
All right. For a long time. And what's interesting now is conversations like the one we are currently engaged in. Most students of history seem to be fairly deeply sympathetic to Benedict Arnold's character. We all acknowledge he seems to have been an asshole and really hard to deal with on an everyday level.
Yeah.
Not the type of person you want to be a coworker with, but it feels like scholarship has come around to the point where we have to really acknowledge, as we certainly did today, just all of the truly stupendous work that he did as a leader in the Continental Army.
Yeah, I mean, however you want to judge him as a person, he's a fascinating character. He did some amazing things, and yeah, I mean, I think you have to acknowledge that the impact he had on the war was, an incredible one.
Yeah, there would be, there wouldn't be in Ohio, it would be Arnold. Maybe not Ohio, but you know what I mean. Like, there would be states, like literal states, or one state, probably, with his
Well, he
name
probably
on it.
have at least a lot of towns and counties named after him, like Lafayette,
Right.
something like that.
Everyone gets towns and counties. He'd at least have a city. I'll say that. He'd at
Yeah,
least have a city.
yeah. Instead of that, you can't say he's forgotten, but he's certainly not honored in any way, and nor should he be. He
Right.
should be remembered. The stuff he did should be remembered, but you can't really honor the man after what he did.
It's a shame. The name Benedict is a really cool name. And not a lot of Americans getting that name.
No.
Michael, this has been an amazing discussion. This is by far the longest conversation we've had. I thank you for returning. Next week, we will be back. It's funny, I told my wife before we started, I'm like, we're just doing Arnold. It should be pretty short compared. No, that's why we just did Arnold this time. Next week, we talk about February 19th and the five people who were promoted over Benedict Arnold back in February of 77.
Evan, yeah.
Seven, yes, nailed it. Michael, thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
Founder fans, we'll be back with Michael Troy next week for a whole bunch more Major Generals.